I think it is a good thing. I mean, there were periods, like at the breakup of the Beatles where we weren't so friendly, so you couldn't do anything like this.
In a recent talk with The Guardian, Paul McCartney shocked fans everywhere by openly naming the women he claimed he could never forgive. Now at 83, rather than hiding from old memories, the Beatles icon calmly revisited the emotional scars that shaped his journey. One spread false stories about his faithfulness, ending his engagement on the eve of his wedding. Another fell for a fellow bandmate, tearing apart a friendship. And one, he said, was at the very heart of the Beatles' destruction, closing the golden age of world music. But who exactly were these women? And among them, who wounded Paul McCartney the most? First came Yoko Ono, the disruptor, the woman history blames for ending the Beatles. London, spring of 1966. When the Beatles were still the world's untouchable band, John Lennon met someone who would forever alter music's course. That night at the Indica Gallery, a small Japanese artist prepared her eccentric showcase, Yoko Ono. She was known in avant-garde circles for daring, boundary-pushing art. In her famous cut piece, she sat silently while strangers sliced away her clothes. John Lennon, tired of this good boy mask, was instantly captivated by her courage. Within days, they exchanged letters about art, dreams, and philosophy. Paul at first brushed her off as one of John's quirky new friends, unaware a storm was forming. By 1968, Yoko began appearing inside Abbey Road's sacred studio. The Beatles had a rule. Only the four of them and producer George Martin were allowed during sessions. Yoko ignored it, placing her chair beside John's and interrupting with casual advice on melody and rhythm. An EMI engineer remembered, every time Yoko spoke, Paul's jaw tightened and silence filled the room. Tension thickened throughout the White Album. George Harrison stormed out mid-session. Ringo said later, "I felt like a spare part." Paul, ever the perfectionist, felt invaded. "I can't create while someone sits there staring like a judge," he said. During one recording, Yoko suddenly suggested using a metal basin for percussion. Paul glanced at John, John smiled, and producer George Martin quietly slipped out for a cigarette. Nobody objected, but the air grew unbearable. From being John's companion, Yoko swiftly became the unofficial fifth Beatle. John started coming late, leaving early, and writing mostly with her. Their nude album cover for Unfinished Music, #1, Two Virgins, forced EMI to issue an apology for indecency. Paul and the others were stunned. John Lennon no longer seemed part of the Beatles. British media ridiculed her. The Daily Mirror called Yoko the most disliked woman in England. While NME sneered, "When the Beatles go quiet, Yoko screams louder." Meanwhile, John's wife Cynthia was heartbroken. She found Yoko living in her home before divorce papers even arrived. Paul later said, "I pitied Cynthia, but John was already gone." When Paul suggested restarting fresh energy with the Get Back project in 1969, John snapped, "I've got Yoko. I don't need the Beatles." Biographer Hunter Davies described it as the gunshot that ended music's greatest friendship. Paul felt Yoko's reach even in business decisions. When Apple Corp faced collapse, he wanted Linda's father, Lee Easton, to manage. John, guided by Yoko, picked the notorious Alan Klein, a move that split the band and triggered years of lawsuits. The feud even bled into music. Paul's Too Many People jabbed at John and Yoko. "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." John retaliated with, "How do you sleep? The only thing you done was yesterday." George Harrison played guitar on it, deepening Paul's hurt. The press called it the post-Beatles war, and fans divided into Paul and Yoko camps. Reporters dubbed Yoko Eve, the woman who ruined rock's paradise. After John's murder in 1980, many assumed Paul would forgive. But in 1987, he told Esquire, "I never felt at ease around Yoko. She made me feel controlled." That remark reignited old fires. At Lennon's 1990 memorial, Paul avoided even glancing her way. One BBC writer noted, "They stood together, yet worlds apart." Time moved on, but Paul stayed distant. In his 2023 podcast, McCartney, A Life in Lyrics, when asked again, he sighed, "I lost my best friend. I don't know who to blame, but it began when she walked into the studio." That single line felt like his deepest confession. Half a century later, despite the timeless songs he made with John, Paul never fully accepted the presence of a third person between them. Now Yoko, over 90, lives quietly in New York, seldom seen. Paul still performs across continents, but refuses to discuss her. He said, "I'd rather not go there," once. The words were brief, yet everyone knew the wound still throbbed. To most, Yoko was an artist ahead of her time. To Paul McCartney, she represented loss of a brother, a band, and a shining piece of his youth. And that heartbreak was only the start. The next woman, Heather Mills, would not just hurt Paul's heart, but make the world laugh at the last Beatle standing. Anyone who dared insult her was met with silence. The entire arena froze. Paul could feel his golden image slipping away. "Back with the Beatles, I was part of a legend. With Wings, I was just a husband defending my wife," he later reflected. In 1995, Linda received the devastating news, breast cancer. Paul stopped everything, escorting her from the Mayo Clinic to the Royal Marsden Hospital in London. Each dawn, he drove her through the countryside, hoping her smile would return, but the illness only deepened. On April 17, 1998, Linda took her last breath at their Tucson ranch. Paul sat beside her, hand in hand, quietly strumming "Let Me Roll It." The world grieved, though headlines divided. Some praised Linda as the woman who anchored the greatest Beatle. Others cruelly wrote, "Now Paul can make real music again." Those words wounded him more than any loss. During a short interview after the funeral, he murmured, "Linda always believed I was more than the Beatles. I never knew that belief came with pain." Years afterward, during the 2001 Wingspan documentary, Paul wept watching old clips of her being booed. "I once blamed her for ruining my name. Now I only blame myself for not saying sorry sooner," he confessed. Linda was gone, but the arguments about her never ended. To fans, she redeemed Paul. To critics, she destroyed his musical purity. To Paul himself, she was the love that both healed and hurt him. After she passed, he locked away his heart for 4 long years, until another woman appeared, bringing cameras, chaos, and one of Britain's most expensive divorces. This time, the world saw not a legend, but a man worn and guarded. Then came Jane Asher, once Muse, later the mirror that exposed him. In 1963, when Beatlemania first struck, Paul McCartney met Jane, a fiery 17-year-old actress, radiant with English grace. They met at a BBC studio where she was interviewing the band for Radio Times. Paul, seated at the piano, saw her walk in and thought, "I'm done for." Jane was unlike anyone he'd ever known, bright, cultured, deeply artistic. She lifted Paul out of Liverpool's pub world and into London's elite circles of poets, playwrights, and thinkers. The Asher home on Wimpole Street soon became his refuge. In that small attic, he composed Yesterday and I Love Her and We Can Work It Out. Together they became Britain's favorite couple. Newspapers hailed Jane as England's muse and Paul as the dream fiancé. Every photo of them together made the nation swoon. Everyone expected a fairy tale ending. In Christmas 1967, Paul proposed with a ruby ring in Soho, and the news lit up the country. But while the nation prepared for a royal wedding, their story was crumbling. After a U.S. trip, Paul grew detached, lost among parties and artists. Jane stayed silent until one night in 1968 when she returned home early from a play and saw the lights still burning on Cavendish Avenue. Opening the door, she froze. Paul sat with a dark-haired woman, the room scattered with wine and sheet music. That woman was Francie Schwartz, a young writer newly hired at Apple. Jane needed no words. She simply turned and walked out forever. Later, she said only, "Every woman knows when she's been betrayed." The story broke overnight. Daily Mirror screamed, "Jane Asher leaves Beatle fiancé after catching him with another." Britain was stunned. The next morning, Jane appeared calmly on BBC's D-Time, saying, "I am no longer engaged to Paul McCartney." That single sentence shattered Paul's clean image. He vanished for months before reappearing beside Francie at Apple. The press branded him the heartless Beatle. Jane's fans sent hate letters accusing him of killing England's sweetest dream. Paul felt as if the whole world had put him on trial. From that moment, the label of unfaithful man never left him. Even when he poured himself into music, the scandal lingered. Biographer Hunter Davies wrote, "He didn't just lose Jane, he lost the trust of a nation." Ironically, his most haunting breakup songs came from that heartbreak. For No One captured Jane's farewell. We Can Work It Out was his musical apology. But no melody could fix what was gone. Jane threw herself into acting, becoming an icon of independence. When asked about Paul, she said, "I once knew him, but that was someone else." Paul, meanwhile, dodged her name for decades. In a rare 1984 interview, he admitted, "She said one sentence, and the world turned its back on me. Time passed, but the pain remained." When BBC replayed that D-Time clip in 2017, Paul quietly walked off stage. A staffer recalled, "He smiled, but his eyes froze, like an old scar had reopened." Jane Asher now lives quietly with her husband, director Gerald Scarfe. Paul, though a legend of melody, still bears the shadow of the man who broke the good girl's heart. And for every woman after her, the pattern only deepened. Next came Cynthia Lennon, the ex-sister-in-law who turned memory into accusation. While the world adored John and Cynthia's love story, she later revealed it was far from perfect. Married in 1962, she lived through poverty before fame changed everything. Among the Beatles, Paul was the visiting kind, playing with Julian, bringing gifts, writing "Hey Jude" for the boy after John left. The gesture made the world adore him, but later became his heaviest burden. In May 1968, Cynthia returned from Greece to find John and Yoko together. "They didn't need to explain," she wrote later. John soon walked out, and the Beatles began to fracture. Cynthia became the nation's sympathy figure, while Yoko bore the blame. Paul tried to stay neutral until Cynthia wrote A Twist of Lennon in 1978. In it, she painted Paul as cold and controlling, caring more for music than people. The quote exploded across newspapers. Overnight, the gentle Beatle became the arrogant one. When asked, Paul snapped, "She's just trying to sell books." The remark backfired, branding him cruel. Critics wrote, "Maybe she said what others were too afraid to. Paul only loves his songs." In anger, Paul told friends, "I never wanted to be in that fight. She made me the villain." Decades later, in her second memoir, John, Cynthia revealed Paul once warned John, "Yoko will destroy everything." She admitted he was right, but said John would never forgive him. Whenever her books resurfaced, so did Paul's frustration. He wanted the Beatles to stay buried, a colleague said, but Cynthia never let that happen. To Paul, the pain wasn't her words, it was being dragged into someone else's heartbreak. Though Hey Jude was written in kindness, people claimed he only knew how to write songs, not feel. His image twisted from kind to calculating. When Cynthia died in 2015, Paul posted simply, "She was a good person. I will always remember." No speeches, no flowers, just a silence heavy with memories of John, Yoko, and all the love gone wrong. But if Cynthia reopened friendship wounds, the next woman, Pattie Boyd, revived the sting of temptation. She was beauty itself, the muse who tangled the Beatles' brotherhood. In 1964, George Harrison met Pattie on A Hard Day's Night set. She dazzled with blue eyes and sunlight hair. "You'll have dinner with me, won't you?" George asked. She laughed, then said yes. Their 1966 wedding was small and sweet, with Paul as best man. Around that time, Paul wrote Here, There, and Everywhere, and rumors whispered it was for her. As the group began to splinter, Pattie's beauty stole headlines across London. Then came Eric Clapton, George's friend, who fell hopelessly in love with her. His song Layla was his confession. When he told George, George simply poured more tea and said, "Drink up, mate." But soon, gossip papers linked Paul too. Reporters claimed he'd once flirted with Pattie during filming. No proof ever surfaced, but tabloids ran wild with it. The Sun teased, "George has Pattie, Eric has Layla, what about Paul?" Furious, Paul denied it. "I don't write songs for other men's wives." Yet the papers twisted it into Paul denies affair with Pattie Boyd, only fueling the flames. It wasn't jealousy that hurt him, it was becoming a rumor inside his friend's tragedy. "Just one look from them," he told Q magazine, and people built whole stories. To him, Pattie symbolized every false story that tore the Beatles apart. When Pattie left George and married Eric in 1979, the nation erupted. Paul stayed away, saying only, "I don't want to hear about her anymore."
Layla,
Decades later, her memoirs Wonderful Tonight 2022 and My Life in Pictures 2022 dragged his name back into headlines again. The only Beatle who didn't love Pattie, but the one haunted by her the most, one paper joked. Paul rarely commented. In a 2018 radio chat, asked if the Beatles were ever jealous of each other's women, he smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but we weren't innocent either." That single remark ended the talk and reignited every old headline once more. These days, Pattie Boyd spends her 70s in quiet peace in Surrey, while Paul still commands the stage beneath blinding lights. Yet many whisper that behind his smile there lingers a shadow of wariness, as though he fears that, with a single glance or rumor, the adoration could vanish once more. For in his long road through fame, Paul McCartney discovered that melodies may outlive the man, but the women who wove through his story, Yoko, Linda, Jane, and Pattie, became the quiet harmonies haunting his legend. Among their names, a few still send a chill down Paul's spine when mentioned. Chief among them is Francie Schwartz, the woman who stepped through his door one warm 1968 evening and tore apart England's sweetest love in hours. At number 7, Francie Schwartz, the stranger who broke an engagement and branded Paul as a betrayer. It was the summer of 1968, and Britain was still hypnotized by Beatlemania. Paul McCartney seemed untouchable, adored by millions, rich beyond belief, and engaged to England's golden girl, Jane Asher. But fate rarely offers warnings. In just weeks, a newcomer from New York entered his life and changed its course forever. Francie was a bold 23-year-old writer who came to London seeking a job at Apple Corps. In her memoir, she recalled the moment they met at the company's Savile Row office. "I walked in, he looked up, smiled and asked if I liked music." That innocent question opened the door to a brief but burning affair. Paul was lonely, Jane was away on stage, and the strain of fame had worn him thin. Francie's free-spirited nature was a rush of oxygen in his crowded life. After only a few encounters, she moved into Cavendish Avenue, the very house where Paul had written Yesterday. And Hey Jude, Francie would later recall. Paul stayed up to sunrise, strumming his guitar, writing songs in the kitchen while she brewed coffee and waited. But the waiting ended abruptly. One July morning in 1968, Jane Asher returned early from her play in Bristol. She opened the door to music drifting through the air and saw Paul with Francie. That image closed their story forever. Without a sound, she set her keys on the table and walked away. 3 days later, she appeared on BBC's D Time. When asked about her wedding, she quietly said, "Paul and I are no longer engaged." One simple line, enough to shake all of Britain. Daily Mirror screamed, Jane Asher catches Paul McCartney with American Girl. Overnight, the nation's golden boy became its greatest villain. Francie, suddenly infamous, was painted as the New Yorker who ruined England's dream. Jane's fans sent angry letters to Apple's office, while Paul chose silence. A Beatles insider told Melody Maker, Paul wasn't furious with Jane, he was furious with himself and with Francie for not keeping it secret. The scandal might have faded, but in 1972, Francie published her memoir, Body Count, spilling intimate details that reignited the flames. Rolling Stone noted, Paul McCartney felt betrayed twice, once in love, once in reputation. Paul called it a worse betrayal than a bad song. After that, Francie vanished from London's scene and Paul spent years rebuilding his image. He refused to speak her name, though once in an interview with Anthony Dirtis, he sighed, "If not for Francie, I might have married Jane. Everything could have turned out differently." A quiet confession that said everything. Though Francie stayed for mere months, she left a scar that lingered for decades. Through her, the world saw the Beatles not as gods of pop, but as men who faltered in love. And just as Britain tried to move past the heartbreak, another whisper rose across the ocean, this time from Hollywood. A young actress named Peggy Lipton, said to be Paul's new muse. Number 8. Peggy Lipton, the Hollywood rumor that turned Paul into the Beatles' playboy. In the shimmering chaos of Los Angeles, where every glance could spark a headline, Paul McCartney learned how quickly admiration could turn cruel. One party, one photograph, and the shy songwriter became the world's most charming scandal. It began at the Beverly Hills Hotel, during a Capitol Records gala for the Beatles' U.S. tour. Among stars and flashbulbs, Paul met Peggy Lipton, a blonde with soulful eyes and a smile that silenced the room. They talked briefly about California, music, and films, but when a photo caught Peggy laughing and touching Paul's shoulder, everything spiraled. The next morning, Los Angeles Times roared, "Beatle Paul finds new love in Hollywood." The story spread like wildfire. New York Post claimed romantic dinners. Daily Mirror imagined beach strolls, all from a single blurred image. At the time, Paul was still devoted to Jane Asher, the nation's sweetheart, but the rumor shattered that image, branding him a faithless playboy. On The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson asked bluntly, "Are you dating Peggy Lipton?" Paul smiled faintly. "We're just friends. I don't even remember what we talked about." But the denial arrived too late. The story had taken flight. Peggy's silence only deepened the wound. Variety wrote, "If she won't deny it, it must be true." That single line circled the globe, sealing Paul's unwanted nickname, the Beatle Playboy. Furious, he called manager Brian Epstein. "How do we stop this?" Epstein only sighed, "In Hollywood, Paul, silence means confession." Even as Rubber Soul redefined their music, Life magazine reduced him to a headline, from Beatle to Playboy. Derek Taylor, his friend, noted in his diary, Paul said nothing, just whispered, "One picture," and it all crumbled. The rumor outlived the truth. Whenever Peggy was spotted with Elvis or Quincy Jones, journalists resurrected Paul's name. He carried the label for years. In 1971, David Frost asked about Hollywood affairs. Paul replied dryly, "Some people need only silence to ruin you." Everyone knew who he meant. Advertisers hesitated, and Paul's wholesome image dimmed. Only after marrying Linda Eastman in 1969 did forgiveness come. Proof, they said, that he had matured. Yet privately, Paul held on to the sting. Years later, when asked again, he said softly, "I don't blame Peggy, but I'll never forget." Time marched on. Peggy shone again in Twin Peaks, while Paul kept performing, steering clear of Hollywood's traps. But just when the dust settled, another name, French, elegant, untouchable, drew him back into the fire. Françoise Hardy, the Parisian muse who pulled Paul into a love story that never existed. In the mid-60s, as the Beatles ruled the world, France had its own queen. Hardy's melancholic voice and quiet allure made her a symbol of effortless beauty. Unlike Bardot's boldness, hers was grace in silence. Then, in 1964, their worlds crossed at the Beatles' first Paris show at the Olympia Theatre. Françoise sat in the front row, eyes steady on the stage. Paul spotted her and later recalled, "I couldn't believe she was really there." After the concert, Brian Epstein invited her backstage. A photographer caught them smiling shyly, a moment that sparked decades of rumor. The next morning, Françoise shouted, "Beatle Paul charms Paris's muse." British tabloids echoed it instantly. Paul, humiliated, denied it to NME. "I met her once, no dates, nothing." But denial meant little. The myth was too romantic to die. When Hardy released La Maison des Grandis in 1966, critics hinted that her sorrowful tone came from an English Beatles love. It enraged Paul. In a letter to Derek Taylor, he wrote, "I never loved Françoise Hardy, but it seems France insists I did." What stung more was Hardy's quiet. She neither confirmed nor denied it. In 1969, she simply said, "He's charming." That single, feather-light sentence reignited everything again. From then on, every time Hardy released an album, Paul's name returned to the spotlight. By 1971, Paris Match dubbed them Europe's most famous unconsummated romance. On American talk shows, Paul was asked if France's muse ever turned him down. He laughed it off, but the irritation showed. Years later, he told the BBC, "I admire Françoise, but I'm exhausted by stories people invent." When Hardy's memoir Les Despised d'Angels appeared in 2008, fans wondered if she'd mention him. She did, just once. "One night in Paris, I met Paul McCartney. We talked about music." That single, feather-light sentence revived headlines once again. To Paul, it wasn't gossip anymore. It was proof that fame rewrites truth. In his 2013 Out There tour, he admitted, "The worst thing is when people write love stories about you, and all you see is trouble." The Françoise Hardy saga faded like a song with no ending, but for Paul, it was a lesson carved deep. That sometimes, what never happened leaves the deepest bruise. And now, after decades of silence, Paul McCartney finally allows the world to glimpse the cracks beneath the perfection. Behind the immortal songs lie heartbreaks that never quite healed. Women who brought passion, betrayal, and quiet sorrow that shaped half a century of music. Perhaps it's those very wounds that make his melodies timeless. So what do you think? Which woman left the deepest scar on Paul's heart? Tell us below, and remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more hidden stories from the world of music and Hollywood's untold legends.